Hello, and welcome to this Islamic History and Thought lecture series session organized by the Institute of Ismaili Studies. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Orkan Mirkasimov. I am Associate Professor at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, and it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker and discussant today. Thank you both for being with us today. Professor Muhammad Faruque is our speaker. He is the Inayat Malik Associate Professor and the Taft Center Fellow at the University of Cincinnati and a former visiting scholar at Harvard University. His award-winning book, Sculpting the Self, published by University of Michigan Press in 2021, addresses what it means to be human in a secular post-Enlightenment world by exploring notions of selfhood and subjectivity in Islamic and non-Islamic philosophical literatures, including modern philosophy and neuroscience. He is the author of 3 books and over 50 academic articles, which have appeared or are forthcoming in numerous leading peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes. He is also a recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including the prestigious Templeton Foundation Global Philosophy of Religion grant and the Title IV grant of the US Department of Education. Dr. Dariush Muhammad Poor is our discussant today. He is the interim head of the Constituency Studies Unit and associate professor in the Department of Academic Research at the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London, and a lecturer for the Department of Graduate Studies. He is also the editor of the Ismaili Heritage Series. His areas of expertise cover Ismaili philosophy, mysticism, Persian literature, and contemporary Muslim politics. He has a wide range of publications in these areas. So the title of today's talk is Sculpting the Self, Islam, Selfhood, and Human Flourishing. Please, Professor Faruque, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Mirkasimov, for that very kind introduction. I'd also like to thank the Ismaili Institute for kindly inviting me to present this lecture on my humble book, Sculpting the Self, which was published a few years ago. As is mentioned, the title of the talk is Sculpting the Self, Islam, Selfhood, and Human Flourishing, which is also the title of my book. So let me provide a kind of brief overview before moving on to the specific parts of this presentation. So there are 3 parts. In the first part, I'll be talking about the self itself, which is the main focus of this talk, and various theoretical and methodological difficulties one faces when investigating this particular concept, which is so important in practically all the different disciplines that we study. So this will be done from a global perspective or global philosophy perspective, as we'll see. But the talk also has a section on the history of self in the Islamic tradition, where I'll be kind of try to provide a summary of some of the main conceptions of the self in the different traditions of Islamic thought. And then the third part will discuss the particular theory of the self that I'm proposing through this lecture. All right, so that's the kind of lineup, and then of course, brief summary. So let's begin the theoretical part. But because this talk is based on my book, I thought of at least summarizing some of the main highlights of the book, because in the presentation itself, I'll not be able to talk about all the different aspects of the book, obviously. But basically, the question that is at the very heart of the book and also this presentation is the following. Namely, what does it mean to be human in the post-Enlightenment world? And while trying to answer that, the book proposes a new spectrum theory of the self. It also offers new options for addressing central issues in the contemporary world, including spirituality, human flourishing, and meaning in life. And while doing so, it draws together Islamic, European, and Indian philosophical traditions with neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, and anthropology. It also argues against views that narrowly restrict the self to a set of cognitive functions and abilities and human behavior. So that's basically the kind of highlight of what I tried to accomplish in the book. And you can already see it's very wide-ranging. It's for academics especially, the word would be very extremely ambitious, because usually the academic studies are very kind of focused in a very niche field. And we have all of these demarcations like, religious studies, humanities, social science, and so forth. So I come from a very different perspective when addressing these questions. In a way, trying to curve my own methodology while trying to answer questions that are of importance, that are of interest to not just people, not just academics, but people across the board. Like my assumption is that we all take the question of what it means to be human in our own world very seriously, or it figures in one way or another when we try to think about various global problems. But while doing so, it also has an intellectual history part. So I do, as I mentioned, I do also try to engage with Islamic philosophers, specifically three main Islamic philosophers. Of course, there are others, but basically Mullah Sadra and Shah Waliullah from the 18th century India, and Muhammad Iqbal. Actually, all of these figures are well known. So in a way, if you're coming from a more academic, more Islamic studies background, then you'll be looking for a kind of intellectual history probably. But so that part is actually there as well. But what I'm trying to do is to philosophize with these historical material. All right, I think this is a good place to kind of talk about the problematic of the self. Because that's what the first chapter in the book does, and that also explains what I'm trying to do. So the first question that emerges from the title and also from this topic is whether there is such a thing as the self. Is there such a thing as the self? Why do I ask that question? Because if we are familiar with Buddhist theories, we know that Anatman, or in general, they talk about no self. They deny that there is a self, although Buddhist theories are very complex, from Nagarjuna to Vasubandhu to Chandrakirti. But generally speaking, that seems to be the case. And then there are also Western philosophers, apparently, like Nietzsche, denying that there is any subject behind doings, behind actions that we perform. Although Nietzsche's theory, again, is complex because he does talk about Übermensch. And then, of course, we know postmodernists talk about the self in a way that I would say deprives it of any essence or inherent reality. And then even analytic philosophers like Dennett and then Anthony Kenny, they say that there's no such thing as the self. So even to begin the discussion, we need to address that question, because many people are wondering, I mean, is there anything called the self even to begin with? But so there are those people for whom there is no self. On the other hand, there are people for whom there are too many selves. Again, there are philosophers who talk about different selves. And then if you do a more focused investigation in how, because my assumption is that this is one of the most familiar words, not only in everyday discourse, and about which there's no kind of dispute because everybody understands when you use the word self. But when it comes to when it comes to its philosophical and academic usage, as found in different disciplines such as anthropology and sociology, you often wonder, especially in light of what I just said, whether there's a self or no self. So whether people are kind of talking past one another, because how is it that they're using the same word and then some people are completely denying that there's anything called a self. Others are saying there are too many selves. Others denying in a way but saying it has no inherent reality and so forth. So one example, one more focused example, the way we study selfhood in anthropology and on sociology, or the way the word figures, the explanation that is often given can be called social constructionism, which is the lens through which selfhood is studied. And so the idea is that ultimately what we call as the self is a construct. It is constructed through economic infrastructure, fields of discourse, social domination, race, class, gender, neurobiology, evolutionary psychology, etc., etc. So this perspective, namely social constructionism, which has a long pedigree history going back to Hegel and others, Marx, and of course down to our own time. This seems to be very dominant, and in religious studies and in other fields as well, people kind of take it for granted. So there's that problem, definitely. Like, is it ultimately a construct, or there's a kind of essence to it that matters for ethics and ontology? So there's definitely that problem. So what I tried to do in the book is to come up with a framework to come up with a framework, not just to study the self in Islam, but also to study it on a global scale. Because these theoretical models, in anthropology and sociology, it's not specific to just the Euro-Atlantic world. People, when they pick up a book on anthropology and the word figures practically in every other chapter or any book on anthropology, because it's such an important concept, it has an impact on the way we think about the world. So I know this has not been done in the way that I was thinking. And I know it's extremely ambitious because of the assumptions of, if you want to study the self, then you better do it within a particular context, because it may be that modern conceptions have no relations at all with medieval, pre-modern, I use the word non-modern Islamic discourses on the self. Because that assumption, people usually think that, if you're talking about the self, all right, just make it look like academic, think about your particular languages, your particular time period, and restrict it to there. While, the theories that we'll be using to study those philosophers in the Islamic tradition, let's say Mullah Sadra, Safavid period, will come from a source like anthropology, sociology, which are already assumed to be universal. Because they're kind of assumed to be universal, we're not supposed to even ask questions whether the self in anthropology and sociology or in analytic philosophy has its own parochial, very limited, perspectives and bias. So I know I'm already kind of sounding a lot right now, because now people are perhaps alerted. As long as you talk about the self within your tradition, whether it's Islamic, Chinese, or even pre-modern Islam, pre-modern Western tradition, let's say Plato, that's fine. But come on, don't touch these big guys, and big disciplines here, which are the framework. When you use the word even theory, the theory is supposed to be universal, supposed to come from these disciplines. And if you want to kind of challenge that, either people will ignore you, or they will feel very uncomfortable, and they will not perhaps want to engage you. But it is the question that I'm asking, and I would expect kind of challenges or questions, counter questions, I think is valid. The question that I'm asking is valid, whether we can study the self because the question, what does it mean to be human, in the post-enlightenment model seemed to be such an important question for all of us, whether that's a valid question or not. Anyway, how to study the self on a global scale? So that was one of the impetus, one of the main purposes of writing that book. So I came up with this spectrum idea of the self. But as I hinted, there is also a particular perspective, normative model that I propose, which comes from my discussions and engagement with Islamic and also non-Islamic philosophers. So as I said, this is about doing philosophy with historical materials. It's about going beyond Eurocentrism, as you can see. So it's a very different approach. So to help the readers, there are various charts and tables in the book. I kind of lay out different perspectives on the self, and I categorize them. Western, non-Western, and Islamic, non-Islamic. For example, this is a chart which has all of these different views. Minimalist. Under minimalist, I put the phenomenological views. And then under in-between view, I put substantialist, narrative, ownership, embodied, neuroscientific conceptions. And then under maximalist, I put Advaita Vedanta, Indian philosophy, and Neoplatonism, Islamic metaphysics. And then no self, fragmented self, Buddhist conceptions, bundle theory of Hume, analytic denials, like Derek, perfect, postmodern varieties, Lacan, Foucault, Butler, and others. So these are some of the ways. Of course, there are other theories as well. And then the sort of the end product of this in the framework that I was talking about is the following: the architectonic of the self. This is a very complex diagram, but I assume that it would, after my talk, if you're not already familiar with my book, maybe you'd be interested to kind of take a deeper look, because you can't explain all of these details in just 20, 30 minutes, 40 minutes. And beside that book, I publish more than a dozen articles. Some of them are forthcoming on different aspects of the self, and some of them deal with Western traditions or Indian traditions as well. But basically, this is the theory I come up with. And I believe this will allow us to kind of resolve some of the kind of contradictions, at least apparent contradictions, that we encounter when we see the word self in different disciplines, such as psychology, anthropology, historical studies, and philosophy, and so forth. So how to resolve those contradictions? So we begin with the word self. We argue that it's a spectrum concept. And I have various arguments for that, and I'll not go into them because those are very complex technical arguments. And then the insight that comes out of this is the idea of multidimensionality. So what happens when, for example, we study the self under a particular discipline and we use lenses like social constructionism, is that we kind of focus on only one dimension of the self, which I call, for example, in this context, sociocultural self, and which is important. Who deny that our self-concept, our self-understanding, our conception of who we are is, to some extent at least, is not determined by the environment, our historical situatedness, and various components of our identity, such as religion, race, gender, etc., etc. I mean, those factors have an impact on the way we think about ourselves. But is that all? Is there no essence to the self? I know the word essence is hated by people whom I'm talking about. Or beyond the even essence, is there nothing else you can talk about? How about the cognitive and experiential dimension of yourself, the first-person subjectivity? Is this reducible to the social constructionism? I argue that no. And again, I provide a lot of different arguments. I'm not going to get into that. But I feel like while it's important to take into consideration the social or sociocultural dimension, it's also important to look at other dimensions. So for example, when you read scientific stuff, especially from neuro and cognitive sciences, you see the self more in terms of various bodily processes, and especially in terms of the brain and how the brain is kind of determining your conception of the self, or in extreme cases, they even argue that the self is an epiphenomenon of the brain and something. And they produce tons of quote unquote empirical evidence to kind of argue for those things. So again, I think there's something to be gained. So I call that biophysiological self. I think when we're talking about the self, it's not a completely disembodied entity. We are embodied and we are embedded in a particular sociocultural historical space, if you will, a particular point in cosmic history. But our body and the bodily dimension does figure in our conception of the self. And again, there are various arguments that can be provided. So you can see that there is definitely, you can distinguish the biophysiological dimension from sociocultural dimension, which can be further distinguished from cognitive experiential dimension. But then that's not all, because when you turn now to religious discourses, let's say Islam, you often hear about fitra, the primordial disposition, and that word is like mired in all sorts of controversy and mystery and across different fields of Islamic inquiry. Anyway, the idea is that in religious discourse, you encounter what I call an ethical and spiritual self. So again, people wonder how to explain those. So I have in this diagram, what I call the distinction between the descriptive and the normative level. It will take some time to kind of absorb some of these complex distinctions, but hopefully, I mean, many reviews have been written. I don't want to really, blow your own trumpets, but it has been received well. The book overall has been received very well. It received the World Book Award and then many other distinctions and so forth. Which I was not expecting anyway, but the idea is that under descriptive level, you can study the self more scientifically. You can study it as an object of sociological inquiry, because these tend to kind of describe, whereas in other places, like religious discourses or in sometimes philosophical conceptions, it's more about ethical and spiritual dimension that we're talking about. And because in different disciplines, there might be some exception in there, but even in the works of so-called great philosophers and theorists, because these distinctions are not kind of taken into consideration or ignored, overlooked, not understood, there seem to be all of these contradictions and contradictory kind of statements about the nature of the self. So this is a kind of global framework that I believe would be helpful, not just to study the self in Islam, but also across different disciplines. If that is a bit more complicated, here's another way to kind of visualize what I'm trying to explain. The self as a multi-dimensional entity and having all of these concentric circles, and the features of concentric circles should apply, namely the interrelations and like how one circle contains the other. This is another way to look at it. All right, I think that's the first part. Yeah. So let's move on to the second part, where it's about the self. It's about selfhood in Islam, in the Islamic tradition. So while I was engaging with various philosophers and trying to figure out a theoretical model, my insights or my perspectives was informed by a number of different philosophers, but some of them are from the Islamic tradition, and especially, I would say, the Islamic tradition more than the other traditions. So the book has, as I mentioned, extensive discussions of how Mullah Sadra, and to some extent Sohrawardi, Ibn Sina, and Sufi philosophers like Ibn Arabi, Shah Waliullah, and modern philosophers like Iqbal discuss the self. So I think at this point we're wondering, so the fact that the self is such an important and complex, complex term, how is it understood by Islamic philosophers? Were they sort of aware of some of these kind of problems that we encounter while studying the self, or they just assumed that it's kind of unproblematic? So the answer is that no, just as in modern discourse or in modern Western discourse, there are all of these controversies about the complexities of the term. The same can be found with respect to the Islamic, the kind of the overall trajectory of Islamic self, the Islamic tradition, beginning with the Quran. So let me try to kind of summarize in 10 minutes, and then I'll go to the next part and then try to wrap things up. I think it's already 12:26. All right, so the first thing I guess that should come to mind is what word was used, or what words were used to talk about the self in Islam. Notice this is not a this is already a very interesting question because of some modern assumptions. There are philosophers like Charles Taylor who wrote volumes or tons of pages to argue that selfhood itself is a distinctly modern phenomenon because of features like self-determination, autonomy, and agency, and then self-reflexibility. These are all kind of modern features. Pre-modern people did, in some cases they discussed the self, but it was understood as a kind of passive entity with no kind of agency in mind, and they were not aware of some of these particular features of the self, like reflexivity, for example, which he thinks begins with Descartes, and then Locke and Kant and others kind of take it forward. So there are these modern, not assumption, I would say biases, because in the Islamic tradition, not only is there a word or are many words, but also there are so many different ways people are talking about the self, all the way from Avicenna to Sohrawardi to Mullah Sadra to Shah Waliullah to Iqbal. But let's begin with an outline of the self in the Quran. The word that is mainly used to discuss the self is nafs, N-A-F-S. And there's a kind of spectrum of the self that one can find in the Quran, namely nafsul ammara, lawama, the evil inciting self, blaming self, inspired self, satisfying self, the tranquil self, and so on. But basically, the perspective of the self that is presented in the Quran is that of a moral and spiritual nature, which would correspond to the normative dimensions, and under normative dimensions, the ethical and spiritual dimensions. So now you can see how this diagram can be helpful, can be used. Although I would say the Quran does talk about the self from biophysiological perspective sometimes, but you'll not find something like sociocultural self, or we'll have to really push it hard. But anyway, this diagram can be useful to understand how the self works in various traditions, including Islam. So anyway, the self that is described in the Quran is mainly moral and spiritual. And I tend to kind of explain this through this analogy with Gollum. I don't know if you've watched the film The Lord of the Rings. The Gollum and Smeagol has this famous dialogue. This is so interesting and sometimes funny, but it gives us a perspective on how the self is understood in the Quran when it's using expressions like the evil inciting self, and then nafsul ammara, and vis-a-vis nafsul mutmainna. So basically, there are two strands, there's a kind of divide, moral and ethical divide within the self. There is one part which can be called the lower self, there's another part which can be called the higher part. So how is this explained? How is this understood through this Gollum and self? So I'm going to play this clip. I hope some of us have watched the film already, but you remember Gollum used to be this nice, good hobbit, and then he became Gollum because of his intense ambition and love and greed for power through the ring, and that actually corrupted him. In that greed ultimately corrupted his soul, and he became a kind of disfigured and person. Anyway, so this is all brought out so nicely. But he still had some humanity left. So from time to time, he would have all of this kind of moral, his struggles with his own self. So that is what I think these terms like nafsul ammara, mutma'inna are trying to explain in a way. And this is brought out nicely with this, clip. Let me now share it.
Master have the precious.
Great.
They stole it from us. Sneaky little hobbitses. Wicked, tricksy first. No, master. Yes, precious false. They will cheat you, hurt you, lie. Master's my friend. You don't have any friends. Nobody likes you. Not listening. Not listening. You're a liar. And a thief. No. Murderer. Go away. Go away! I hate you. I hate you. Where would you be without me? Ellen, I saved us. It was me. We survived because of me. Not anymore. What did you say? Master looks after us now. We don't need you. What? Leave now and never come back. No. Leave now and never come back. Leave now and never come back.
All right, I think that should be enough. And I hope you're able to understand what it was trying to convey. Basically, there was one person and it was a projection of his inner self, and he was kind of fighting with his inner self, lower self, to be more precise. Back to the slides. All right, so basically that's how the moral self, in terms of an ethical split, is understood in the Quran and also in other places. So Golem is our double. He's our shadow and our other within the self, the Nafsul Ammara, the evil inciting soul. He's the absurd and the irrational within us. Sometimes we behave irrationally in an absurd way. So he represents that. But then the perspective of the Quran is that Golem or Nafsul Ammara needs to be overcome in order to reach the state of tranquility or Nafsul Mutma'inna. So it's not really, the Golem is a symbol. It's not really, the main point is not about Golem in the Lord of the Rings, as it is the Golem that actually lives within each of us as our lower self or our double. So being human in this perspective, excuse me, being human means being able to overcome the lower self and identify with the higher serene self. And as we look at various Sufi writing, especially Sufi conceptions of the self, we see a further elaborations on this idea of overcoming Nafsul Ammara and reach at the more enlightened state of Nafsul Mutma'inna, serenity and tranquility. So you can kind of have this nice diagram and just explain the journey of the self in the Quran in terms of true self, fitra, and then descent, and then fallen self, and then ascent and journey toward perfection, which is kind of simple. But then by the time you reach 17th century Safavid period, Mullah Sadra, this kind of the circle of the self diagram that I have here, or I call it circle of self-perfection, it becomes way more complicated because we know Muslim discourses on the self, they were influenced by Greek philosophies, Neoplatonism and Stoicism sometimes, and so forth. And then there are other influences. So there are various strands within the Islamic tradition when it comes to the self. There are theological conceptions. I'm going to basically outline them because I don't have much time. Sufi conceptions and philosophical conceptions, and then within philosophical conception there are variations. So Mullah Sadra's conception was influenced by a lot of not just peripatetic philosophy or Greek philosophy, but also Sufism and perspectives from Quran and Shiism and a whole lot of other things. But basically, if you're trying to understand how, let's say, Mullah Sadra explains the self, you have this rather complex perspective where at one point on the circumference, you have return and origin, which are kind of the same. Mabda and Ma'ad. In fact, Mullah Sadra has a famous book on this, and this is one of the central topics. He always comes back to the question of Mabda and Ma'ad, which corresponds to the state of the perfect human, which is also the highest stages, highest state of the self. But then that's kind of the metaphysical picture. But when it comes to the ordinary perspective, ordinary experience of the self, we actually begin as a physical entity. Mullah Sadra's theory of the self does not begin with an immaterial understanding of the self. Rather, the soul or the self, nafs, is a physical entity when it was in the womb of the mother. So it's termed as fetal self, and then basically goes through all of these stages of plant-like self, animal self, and then the human stage where you have full consciousness, and then beyond the human stage, you have angelic and higher angelic, and finally the insanul kamil, or the perfect human. And this journey involves, of course, everything, life, death, beyond death, but also it is possible for the select few to attain all of these stages within this life, and they're called the perfect human, the prophets and the sage. But you can say it's understood in terms of an arc of descent and ascent, well-known perspectives in Sufism, arc of descent and the arc of Qus, Su'ud, Nuzul, and Su'ud in Sufism. And while he discusses all of this, you'll see he brings up kind of sort of biophysiological perspectives, so even sociocultural perspective, and a lot of cognitive experiential perspectives. So the framework, the spectrum theory that I came up with can be applied to study, analyze, understood what Mullah Sadra is saying here. Unfortunately, I don't have too much time, so I have to move fast. But we cannot discuss the self without saying a word about consciousness. And Muslim philosophers like Mullah Sadra, and before Mullah Sadra, of course, Avicenna, Farabi, Razi, and others have a lot to say about consciousness. And there are some words that describe the consciousness in Arabic, such as shurur or shurur, with that self-consciousness. But it's tied to knowledge and perception. Anyway, in Mullah Sadra's perspective, when it comes to consciousness, consciousness is the very stuff of the self. And the self can be understood in terms of different modalities of consciousness. Reflective, which is the beginning of philosophical inquiry, and the intersubjective and non-reflective. Again, very technical terminology, so I'm not going to get into them right now. So that's Mullah Sadra. So very quickly, maybe we can also look at another very comprehensive model of selfhood, especially in Sufi metaphysics or Sufi philosophical Sufism. So this is from Shah Waliullah's Shah Waliullah's writings. And this is a construction, obviously. I came up after studying his works with this model. So the core of the self is constituted by self-consciousness. And self-consciousness itself is constituted through self-presence, or hudur in Arabic. The word is very technical, ilmul huduri, it goes back to Sohrawardi, and then of course even Mullah Sadra. And Shah Waliullah to some extent was definitely familiar with some of these writings, Mullah Sadra's and Sohrawardi's writings for sure. But then his theory incorporates perspectives from Greco-Islamic medical tradition, and then the Aristotelian tradition, and then of course Sufi philosophy. So it is a complex picture. So you go downward, you have what is called in Sufism lataif, and I call them microcosmic lataif. Ruh, qalb, nafs, aql, and then they represent different faculties, different functions of the self. And then you go up, it's a holistic picture. But just for the sake of understanding, it's better to understand with these arrows going upward and downward. So going upward, you have macrocosmic lataif. And then you have the level of universal soul and absolute self, which is the divine self. And so it is a kind of cosmological picture as well. And that's very important, because the self for Muslim philosophers is not understood through the lens of just individualism, or anthropocentrism. It's what I call anthropocosmic. That's the conception that I think captures many of the theories of the self discussed by Muslim philosophers. So just a word about the word nafs, because this word, in a way, not very different from the way the word self is understood in English. It has many, many different connotations. In the Quran, it has mainly a negative connotation. But in Islamic psychology or Sufi psychology, it has sometimes neutral connotations, simply like behavioral inclinations. But at other times, it connotes psychological qualities, features like drives, instincts, impulses, human vulnerability, etc., etc. Anyway, this is another perspective. Now let's see. Oh, it's already 12:43. I think I have about 5 minutes or 3 to 5 minutes. So in Islamic theology, I'll go very quickly. Again, one has to distinguish between early Islamic theology and later Islamic theology, which was influenced by Falsafa tradition very much. But curiously, in Islamic theology, you have a more physicalist understanding of the self, which kind of compares very well with modern neuroscientific conceptions, although the methodologies of these traditions are very different. And the physicalist understanding is because of the cosmology of atoms and existence, accidents. So those of us who are familiar with Kalam discussions, we know it makes sense. But then in classical Islamic theology, in slightly later period like Juwayni and others, there's also the idea of the self as a subtle body, as opposed to jism kathib or dense body. And interesting problems arise from this kind of physicalist conceptions, the idea of the moral deserts. Because if there is no immaterial self, which Islamic philosophers talk about, where may one locate an enduring moral identity on the basis of which one would receive one's deserts in the afterlife? So it becomes a kind of, in my opinion, unsolvable problem. And no wonder some of the later philosophers like Razi, at least in some of his writings, and Jurjani, again, some of his writings, seem to point toward immaterial understanding of the self. All right, so I think I already hinted at this. So there are 3 parts in this discussion. In the first part, I talk about the problematic of the self. In the second part, kind of brief overview of the self in Islam. The last part talks about my own humble conception, which I call the anthropocosmic self. Because there are so many different conceptions of the self. If one is wondering, so all right, how do you describe your conception of the self that you are proposing in the end? So for me, the way to describe would be to invoke the conception of the anthropocosmos. So what is the anthropocosmic self? So again, technical discussions, I'm explaining in a very simple way. The idea is that cosmos and the self, as opposed to modern conceptions of individualism, are not 2 separate realities, but rather 2 sides of the same coin. And the anthropocosmic self reflects an organismic unity which pervades all forms of existence. It's what Al-Kunawi, the well-known student of Ibn Arabi, said, "Kullu shay'in fi kullu shay." Everything is connected to everything else. From that perspective, the reality of the self is no longer located in the conventional conventional conception of the self, only influenced by social factors, or environmental, or one's environment, or psychological drives, and so forth. While the multidimensionality allows for those factors to be considered, there is the kind of inner reality or universal reality of the self, which transcends. And again, this is a more philosophical conception, should not be understood with kind of theological understanding. But it has these ecological implications as well, interconnectedness of all beings. If the reality of the self is no longer located in our own individuality, but incorporates both our individual perspectives, but also understands that there is a kind of deep connection between everything and everything, then this subject-object dichotomy, the way to master, control nature and leading to environmental destructions of all kinds, I think it will have enormous implications. So yeah. So that's the kind of insight that is at work when it comes to the anthropocosmic self. So I should try to end here. Just one slide. So sculpting the self, leading up to the anthropocosmic self, it's not a private matter. I know most of us today are under the sway of this conception that, it's when it comes to the self, it's kind of our own individual desires, unique personality, and so on and so forth. I don't deny that dimension, but I'm very much opposed for all kinds of reasons that I have discussed in the book, also to some extent here, that the idea that the self is simply an autonomous entity is actually an illusion, leading to post-society and all kinds of mental health issues and so forth that sociologists are talking about. So sculpting the self is not a private matter, because even the sociocultural self is very important. When it comes to critically assessing the sociocultural self and how material forces and social systems of power variously advantage and disadvantage different communities based on modern constructs of race, class, gender, nationality, and so forth. So if we understand that it's a social self figures within a multidimensional entity, then it becomes a question of transforming those structures that may lead to disadvantages or sometimes disadvantages. So transforming social structures so that more people can cultivate their normative self and have fewer sociocultural impediments. So that's kind of one particular implication you can see, even from the perspective of sociocultural self. But if it's all about social constructionism and we're leaving no room for moral and spiritual development, then it's very hard to make sense of kind of transforming those structures for all sorts of reasons. All right, so that's the kind of the end of the third part. So here's the summary. So selfhood, in my perspective, is to be understood as a multidimensional entity containing both descriptive and normative dimensions. And it's inseparable from the quest for meaning in life and human flourishing. And that's why, what does it mean to be human in our kind of world is so important to address. So ultimately, I propose an anthropocosmic self that emphasizes self-knowledge, transformation, and perfection, bringing our potential to actuality. The very last thing I would say about the anthropocosmic self is the following. Going back to the very first question I asked, what does it mean to be human? Being human is a task to achieve. It's not a fact to receive. All right, I think I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Muhammad, for this fascinating talk. And I want to say that I think it is very courageous on your part to go off the beaten path. And unlike we usually do a very specialist, research in academia, very focused, to engage with such a central topic across different cultures and disciplines is really an enormous task. One thing that came to my mind while I was listening to you is that the very fact that we asking the questions what the self is, and we're asking them not just now, this is going throughout human history, shows that there is probably some issue that we didn't manage, or at least the most of the mankind didn't really manage to solve. Because if it was something obvious, we would just experience it without asking questions, right? We wouldn't undergo such tensions and try to find out what is the self. Things that is supposed to be the most obvious of all, right? We're all talking and we're using the pronoun I. Self is apparently something we have our individual bodies probably to refer to, but beyond that, what are we exactly referring to is not clear, and I think very few people can really define it clearly. So yeah, I would just stop here and pass the word to to our discussant, Professor Muhammad Poor, please, if you have some comments and questions, please.
All right, lovely. Professor Faruque, thank you very much for this very, very fascinating discussion. I'm very glad that we have discussed this at such a detailed level, even though I think it might have been a little bit sophisticated for some of our audience. I've got a list of 5 questions, which I think I won't be able to ask all of them, so I'll just limit myself to 2, focusing on what you've presented and what you have in the content of your book. But then I'll try to ask a more simpler, more straightforward question without the jargons. So going back to the multi-dimensional model and the interconnection, interconstitution, so to speak, the high priority way of looking at it. So the core framework of your book posits the self as a multi-dimensional spectrum concept, comprising of 2 major non-watertight levels: the descriptive, the biophysiological, sociocultural, cognitive, experiential, and the normative, ethical, and spiritual aspect. So you stress these differences, these different dimensions are not merely superimposed, but are interconstituting. So the first question is, could you elaborate on how these 2 primary levels, the descriptive facts about what the self is versus the normative aspirations about what the self must become or should become, coherently interpenetrate in practice? For instance, how does the discovery of an ethical imperfection, which is normative judgment, fundamentally change the underlying structure of a descriptive aspect, such as the cognito-experiential self? Should I ask the second question, or should I pause here for you to respond to this?
Yeah, better to perhaps pause, because this is already a very important question. And
sorry, I made it very dense. I hope I was straightforward.
No, I think it's clear. What is the connection between descriptive and normative, or can the descriptive be changed in light of some of the normative understandings of the self? So I'll begin with a very simple example, which is easy to deal with, namely our body. So sometimes, especially when there are moments when we feel like our health is not at its best, we need to exercise, we need to have a good physical constitution, and so forth. So we start going to the gym. So that impetus to kind of have a better health, better physical structure is a normative stance vis-a-vis the body. We have this somehow intuition that something which is given, namely the body, which can be understood scientifically, whatever, or even from sociological perspectives. Still, there are facts that I can impose on it, or impose is not the right word, but somehow I can motivate myself to kind of make it something different. So we start going to the gym, and maybe we are satisfied after, I don't know, a couple of months of regular exercise and so forth, or even muscle building, and I don't know. But I think it's, that example applies equally to ourselves. There are moments when we feel like, oh, we're not living up to our optimum level, our potential. We can do much more. We get angry very easily, we might think, or we are not good at controlling our emotions, or we simply lack some of the kind of more humane qualities. So as soon as one has those intuitions, regardless of what one knows about various biophysiological processes, like how our digestive system works, what is the relationship between the brain and perception, and the brain and the rest of the body, how the neurons work, influence our day-to-day operations. We can be even first-class, we can be even first-rate neuroscientists, but it still does not change the fact that we might have those intuitions that we lack something, that when it comes to ourselves, maybe it's an unfinished product. It's a work in progress. So normativity is something that, as you said, it kind of commands us inwardly or guides us. It provokes those motivations to kind of make things better. Whereas when it comes to descriptive dimensions, which we can perform through either sociological or scientific analysis, it leaves things as they are, merely content to describe the state of affairs. Like, for example, describing all the features of the eye and what happens during perception, how light is transducted, transmuted into signals are transmitted into brain signals and technicalities and so forth. So that is different as a description, scientific description, from an understanding that there is something lacking within us, or even lacking with our vision in this case, let's say. So that's the kind of intertwining relationship. We can see the descriptions are very different from normative analysis. Normative analysis of the self from the Quran, thinking of ourselves as constituted by nafsul ammara, lower selves, as a golem that lives within us. And then the next question is obviously how to overcome that golem. It's very different from sociological analysis of how our identities are constructed, based on our beliefs, based on how we participate in language, and so forth. So descriptive analysis by themselves do not propel us to kind of see the self as a work in progress. So, you'd better work on yourself, try to make things better, own way, whatever. So whereas normative dimensions of the self, lead us to a direction where we feel like, it's a question of seeing things from another angle. But there is a relationship. That's the point. There is a relationship.
Thank you. So let me ask the second question. I'll try to be very brief this time. So this has got to do with the element of neuroscience embodiment and where we could go in the future with this one. So in your book, you offer a critique of the neuroscientific reductionism, arguing that claims that equate consciousness with brain processes commit the mereological fallacy by attributing psychological terms to the brain rather than the human person as a whole. However, you acknowledge the necessity of recognizing the self's physiological basis. So what concrete pathways do you envision for a truly fruitful and non-reductive dialogue between the scientific study of the brain and the sophisticated physiological, spiritual models found in Muslim philosophical psychology, such as the system of the subtle bodies, the lata'if? So how might the lata'if framework integrate insights from neural activity without being reduced to it?
Right. Yes, I have written beyond this book other articles on this topic. Most recently, another article called "The Brain and the Making of the Modern Mind," which is available on the Renovatio Journal. But if you just Google "The Brain and the Modern Mind," it sort of deals with the brain specifically and its place in modern culture, its entire history, and so forth. So, I mean, this is a very kind of vast topic in a way, but to come to a more fruitful intersections, I would say that we have to first of all deal with our ontologies. Ontologies, whether it's materialism or it's something we don't know. So there are many scientists now you'll find who are saying that consciousness is before life. It comes before the physical origin of the life or biological origin of the life, or consciousness is more fundamental. So if you start from a perspective where consciousness is fundamental, not matter, although matter can go through all kinds of transformations and so forth, then the way you study the human beings and you do science completely changes. But when we assume that everything is kind of physical and consciousness is an emergent problem, it's the problem of figuring out, David Chalmers called the herd problem. So, we know how the brain processes information and so forth, but that is the how question that science addresses, not the why question. Why is it that we have subjective experiences of what it is like to, let's say, drink a cup of coffee, taste the nice ice cream that, for example, one likes, and so forth. So again, even within materialism, these philosophers and cognitive scientists are finding problems just to simply ask this question: how does the brain create consciousness? And that's a wrong question to begin with. Your experimental designs and your final conclusions will obviously be different if you start from those kind of assumptions, very problematic assumptions that you are taking for granted. Who says so? That why are we assuming that the brain produces the brain produces consciousness. Why not the other way around? At least what kind of evidence do we have? So I mentioned things like, is it ever possible to step outside of our subjectivity and look at consciousness from the outside, as we do with respect to other physical, entities that, brain or trees or whatever we scientifically analyze? No. When we perform these experiments in neuroscience, consciousness is already kind of assumed to be there, intersubjective consciousness. Then, yeah, people can talk about correlates, neural correlates of consciousness, the famous NCC and so forth. But anyway, so there are a few scientists, thankfully, who either realize that consciousness is fundamental, or at least we do not know, so we should not assume. So I think that's a much better approach that tells us about the relationship and not kind of try to give a causal answer, like whether the body and the brain is the kind of absolute and ultimate reality, and then consciousness is something that emerges. You'll notice in my book, I deal with all of these theories, and I categorize them in different terms, and one of them being the emergent theories of consciousness. So that's a bit more sophisticated than simply eliminatism, because there are neuroscientists who simply want to claim that consciousness is a folk notion. It exists only in our conversations. It has no scientific value. That's an extreme position, but there are a lot of scientists that kind of propose that. So yeah, when we realize that, no, there are a lot of unknowns, and as Professor Qasimov was saying, there must be something mysterious about this question, about the question of the self. And it's not a Western modern, those kind of Eurocentric way of looking at things. Buddhist and Hindu Advaitins, let's say, or other Indian philosophers have been discussing this for the last few thousand years with all kinds of complicated theories of consciousness and self. And to this day, it's kind of unresolved in a way. Like, who am I? Ghazali says, as exactly what you said, Professor Qasimov, when we use the word I, everybody understands, like what it is we're talking about. So it seems most obvious. And yet it's such a great paradox that when it comes to the inner reality of the self, when it comes to understanding, explaining what it is ultimately, we have no clue. And sometimes Sufi poetry is actually very useful because it talks about the self in terms of mystery. To ask the question, who am I, ultimately kind of brings up other great questions of philosophy in cosmology and epistemology. So it is not a simple scientific question. I guess that's the first thing we should realize. But I think science is something very important to contribute, as insofar as illuminating the physiological, bodily basis of many of our psychological processes. But as to the very nature of consciousness, we need a very different methodology.
Maybe it's very fitting at this point, because one of our attendees can have kindly shared a piece of poetry, which I think translates very well this inner tension, which is relating to the incapacity actually to clearly experience the I, who am I. So let me just read it. What do I want? I with capital I. Do I know? I with lowercase. This fight between I capital and I lowercase will make me rage. It has already made me insane, me with capitals, in ways the self can't explain. How much acknowledgement does he need? For he craves more, feeding this selfish being, drains the one compassionate, the one selfless, can't help it, but to help on, getting disappointments from I capital, I lowercase, me capital, for compassion can only get you so far. The hatred so ingrained it shatters all hope.
Beautiful, yes.
Yeah, so the note says here, I capital, I lowercase, me lowercase, and me capitals are all different individuals. So this is the experience of having like a multiplicity of eyes, actually.
Yes. And I would say, as I was trying to say through the anthropocosmic self, ultimately those eyes are not located just in what we call human beings. And that's the great tragedy of our time. We managed to see ourselves as something separate from the rest of the world. Whereas if someone is asking for some common insights that we can gain from various traditions, it's the insight of interconnectedness, so important, so deeply needed in our time, because we tend to see ourselves as separate, and in worst cases, and in a very anthropocentric, like someone is superior, and also like, Eurocentric sometimes, seeing oneself as superior to the other and those things. But if we realize that ultimately individualism is one particular version of the self, it explains only one aspect of the self. Because even our body, the air that we breathe, where is it coming from? And with whom are we sharing this air? We're not self-enclosed, individuals, all within our little, enclosed within our little islands, as Tocqueville famously said when he visited America. Rather, we are part of the cosmos. That much, I think, we don't need even so-called spirituality to see that. As I think it was William Blake who said, to see the world in a grain of sand, the famous verse. If we're able to see that our inner reality is ultimately found everywhere, but to be able to go there, we need to penetrate all the dimensions of ourselves and reach the very end of the deepest core of ourselves. Then we'll see that somehow there's a deep connection between ourselves and all other natural entities, which does not remove the differences, because even within humanity, within human beings, the psychological differences are going to be there. But the fact that we care for each other, regardless, and in fact, I can cite a perfect example here. Why is it that upon seeing a child falling into the well, everybody in the world, regardless of their education, religion, race, would be motivated to save the child? Where does that moral feeling come from? We can provide all kinds of evolutionary responses, but I don't think that answers. There are scientists who simply say, oh, the universe does not care for us. The universe that modern cosmologists study is the universe that kind of, first of all, completely removed the human subject. That's why it appears as though, it has no relation. But why do you say so? I mean, if the universe does not care for us as human beings because we are individuals, we are definitely part of the universe. Why is it that in our best moments, we do care for each other? I mean, I don't need to prove that. Where does that caring, feeling, compassion come from if, there's no kind of link, connection between each of us? I think that's a very good insight and intuition that can lead to a lot of things. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much, Muhammad. We have to stop here. So thanks again for joining us, Professor Faruque and Professor Muhammad Poor. Also, thanks to everyone who joined this talk today online. And thanks to everyone who supported the preparation and the delivery of this talk behind the scenes. Special thanks to Nushin Premji, our academic projects and events manager, to our Department of Communications and Development, and to our events team. Thanks again, and I hope to see you all at the next episode of the lecture series.
Thank you so much for facilitating this lecture.
Thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you.